While I was doing my masters at Otago University back in New Zealand, I met this girl from the Netherlands. I, as a young and single guy, wanted to find out everything about the exotic beauty slipping on a lab coat on the bench next to me. But her name, her impossibly complicated Dutch name, her first name was simple enough, Melissa. That I could handle like a pro, but her last name, Legangas, I thought I must find out this vital information to impress my exotic beauty in a lab coat. So I did the obvious thing and went to Google. I soon discovered the pronunciation, Lehangas, and the meaning, idlers, empty people, lazy people. That seemed somewhat insulting. But as it turns out, it's not that unusual to find an amusing Dutch last name. There are families with names like Nachtgeboren, born naked, Poepjes, little poop, and most un-Dutch of all, Van der Berg, all over the Netherlands. So how did these Dutch families get such interesting names? Napoleon Bonaparte, having grown tired of his younger brother's overly independent rule over the Kingdom of Holland, annexed the puppet kingdom into the French Empire in 1810. The following year, Napoleon implemented compulsory military service in the Netherlands, something his overtly independent younger brother had refused to do. But to implement conscription, he would need to be able to find the people. So Napoleon also decreed the mandatory registration of births, deaths, and marriages. The Dutch were less than impressed with all of this, and legend has it that they, assuming that these would prove to be temporary measures, took on comical names to mock the French occupiers. They were half right. Well, Napoleon's empire wouldn't last another 5 years, the names in registry would. While French decree forced the Dutch to adopt permanent family names, Dutch humour predates the Napoleonic era, and most of the Dutch names existed long before 1811. The romantic patriotism of the story, however, caught on, and the story of the Dutch protesting French orders developed into a legend that persists to this day. It doesn't really matter if something is true. If it helps make people feel good about themselves and their country, a slight bending of the truth soon develops into a national legend. So if the Napoleon name myth doesn't answer why the Dutch have their last names, what does? Long before Napoleon took control, in the cities of Holland most people did have last names, sometimes dating back centuries. The adoption had been a gradual process, with different families deciding to adopt the tradition of preserving a last name at different times. However, in the more sparsely populated regions of Frisia, thousands of Dutch peasants were still using a traditional patronymic system in 1810. This is where the father's first name became the son's last name, with some sort of suffix added, and the younger siblings would get names left over from the grandfather, great-grandfather, and so on. So for example, Jan, the Dutch equivalent of John, might have named his son Willem Janssen, Willem, son of Jan, and the Dutch equivalent of Johnson. Willem in turn might name his son Hendrik Willemsen, who then names his child Papa Hendrickson, who, you guessed it, goes on to name his son Peter Poepjes. So this funny Dutch last name turns out to be a patronymic name from the Frisian name Papa, rather than any reference to poop. Or is it? When looking at the origins of names, the exact origins are often lost to time, and this is no exception. The second possibility is that Poepjes was adopted by a family descended from German wage workers, who were often called Puppen, a corruption of the German Buben. Nachtgeboren too may have German origins. It may be an adaptation from the German named Nachtgeboren, meaning born after, referring to children born after their father's death. But an alternative exists here too. It could have simply been a nickname that stuck for someone who reminded their friends that we are all born naked one too many times. You see, often people didn't pick their own name, but had a name given to them by their friends and community. But in 1811, when many of the Frisians who didn't have fixed last names went to register their new official name, they didn't choose a patronymic name. Other options existed, and many chose the name De Vries, resulting in it becoming one of the most common last names in the Netherlands today. Vries comes from an old spelling of Friesland, and so De Vries translates to the Frisian, a patriotic, if not imaginative choice. And Vandenberg is another name referencing a location, in this case a mountain. The Dutch, of course, don't actually have any mountains, but have attempted to elevate the status of some of their hills through their naming conventions. Other Dutch names came from occupations such as Bakker, Visser, or Smit, the Dutch equivalents of Baker, Fisher, and Smith. Which then brings us to that exotic beauty. I followed her to the Netherlands and eventually married her, and we're still in the process of our happily ever after. But her name does come from a nickname for an idler, a citizen with no job or craft, a loafer or sloth. A most inappropriate name for such a hard-working person. She even got herself a PhD, so now you can follow Dr. Lazy Person on Twitter. And by the way, I made a video touching on some of her PhD work too, links to all those in the usual places. This video was made with the help of great people, including those listed here on Patreon. The theme tune is by Richard Jones, and whether by supporting on Patreon, sharing videos, or just watching, thanks to everyone who supports the channel.